Good morning. This morning I'm going to be talking about telepathy. Contrary to what you have seen coming into your inbox, actually what came into my inbox this morning was I was going to be talking about telepathy and intuition. And I thought, wow. I'd sign up for that one. Anyway, but it's just telepathy this morning. Those who are spiritually working on themselves, those who have an otherness consciousness, will sooner or later develop a sensitivity called telepathy. Another word for telepathy that I found in the teaching is called siddhi, S-I-D-D-H-I. Siddhi means psychic power. I thought that was interesting. There's a difference between a feeling and telepathy. I think some of you know this, some of you don't know this. But now you do, just to remember that there is a difference between a feeling and telepathy. However, developing certain feelings not ordinary to your day-to-day life is the first step toward developing a telepathic sensitivity. For example, one day my husband was on the way to our property in a neighboring city, several miles away. After he left, and about 20 minutes later, I jumped into the car, ready to go to the grocery store. But that's as far as I got, because I didn't have my car keys. They weren't in the ignition, which is where, this is back in the day, you know, when you could leave it in your ignition and the car would be there when you went in the next morning, right? Anyway, this was also before cell phone days. So I went back into the house to look for the keys. 5 minutes later, I got a phone call from my husband saying, "Honey, I had a feeling I needed to call you." I said, "Yes, I can't find my car keys." And he says, "Well, I have them here with me." So that was a feeling, which is not really all that uncommon with good friends. When telepathy begins to establish itself in our lives, when it develops, we start translating impressions. The word translating is really important here. We start translating impressions coming to us from others, usually starting with those that are close to us. It may be your spouse, your children, or close friends. In the beginning, your impressions are not always going to be accurate. Your translations are not always accurate for various reasons, but the fogginess does eventually clear up. Mental telepathy occurs through the thought world, and interestingly enough, sometimes through eye contact. Mental telepathy. One of the first real telepathic moments where I had such an experience was at the onset of teaching a beginning esoteric astrology class. About an hour before the class gathering, I began experiencing the thoughts of some students who had registered for the class. I wondered about the source of the thoughts because I know they weren't coming, from my mind. For example, one person was anxious about being on time to the class. Another was thinking about meeting someone for lunch after class. And another one was thinking about personal things. I wasn't sure what was happening or if I was simply imagining these things. The irony, or perhaps confirmation of this level of telepathy, occurred when some of the students reiterated the thoughts that I had earlier heard. So I knew it wasn't my imagination, and it was actually kind of shocking. As time went on during specific experiences, I would hear thoughts in my head coming from a friend, where a few minutes later, they would voice the same thoughts that I had heard in my head. In the beginning, the experience was unnerving. Dreams the night before with another person would be acted out the next day. Spiritual telepathy is a telepathic communication between you and your teacher, your master, the ashram, hierarchy, Shambhala, or communications with great beings. Spiritual telepathy becomes the most significant telepathic experience for us and the most important. These telepathic communications are coming from a higher frequency, and nearly always regarding inspiration or instructions that are some way related to a creative service. Such telepathic communication is helpful if you are a spiritual teacher or counselor or in need of creative help, inspiration, ideas, and so forth. Great ones look for those disciples who can receive their ideas telepathically. Let's say that you are a telepathic educator, speaker, author, or composer. The teacher might mentally or telepathically inspire you in such a way that your knowledge on a particular subject broadens and includes ideas and perceptions not previously known to you. An idea is presented to you either through direct telepathic communication or through specific images. You may be inspired with a short paragraph or even a sentence, just a sentence. What happens is first it comes to the heart center in your brain as an impression. Over time, your consciousness further unfolds and develops, and you will hear exactly what telepathically is being given to you. They do not force you to follow this or that idea, but broaden your consciousness, broaden your thinking in such a way that what you were initially going to do, the approach that you were going to take, is now perceived from a different perspective or with a deeper purpose. If you have been reading the notebooks, the journals of Helena Rourke, you will have recognized this very process. How in the beginning, Madame Rourke's communications with the master were complex, challenging. She had to adjust her mechanism to theirs. It was a new way of communication for her and her husband, Nicholas Rourke. And it was slow going. But over time, she could hear precisely and flawlessly what was being communicated to her. Even images. And you can see in the notebooks, certain drawings, those were drawings, images that were spiritually telepathically given to her. When you have spiritual telepathy in 10 or 20 minutes, and sometimes in a shorter duration of time, you will be able to take your impressions or inspiration, like a specific topic or idea, prepare it, organize it, and then give a lecture. Several years ago, I was participating in a spiritual conference organized by my spiritual teacher. Several of us were there attending the conference. A banquet always followed the end of the conference, and it was no different that week. At the banquet, we were all sitting there, enjoying one another's company, talking about the conference and what we had learned, when my teacher announced that I was to come to the front and give a lecture. I was totally taken off guard. As I walked to the front of the room, where in my shock, it felt as if everybody surely must be staring at me, and startled as well because it wasn't on the schedule for me to talk. All of a sudden, the whole lecture poured into my head. I knew what I was going to talk about. I knew what to say. And it was a 20-minute talk on the subject of beauty. When telepathic energies come to us, it is like a mechanism that is working and is turned on. This is spiritual telepathy. Spiritual telepathy this is really important to understand. This further qualifies and shows us the difference between a feeling and even mental telepathy. Spiritual telepathy is a conscious communication between two minds, higher and lower. A conscious communication between two minds, higher and lower. Now, some people will understand this as channeling, but it is not. In spiritual telepathic experiences, you know the source of the information. And you are conscious, you are awake. Sometimes you can see the impression, sometimes you can hear the impression, just like we're talking out loud here, except it's in your inner ear, we could say. But you absolutely know the source of the information. Channeling is like a pipeline of information coming to you, but you are unconscious of the source. And because you're unconscious of the source, you can easily be misled. There's more to talk about that, but I'm not sure we should. That's interesting in itself. So let me just put that aside, about being unconscious of the source and easily misled. Channeling is lower psychism, plain and simple. It is lower psychism, where the receiving person may not necessarily understand or know the source of information, with subsequent consequences later in their life, and it usually affects their health. Health difficulties will occur such as developing problems with their nervous system, experiencing dementia, memory loss, and other mental health problems. In their practice of channeling, they do not grow in the process. This is very important. If you channel, think about this. Realize that you are not growing in the process of channeling and your consciousness is not expanding. And the concern that we have is, like I was saying, later in life. What's later in life? Maybe 10 years later, maybe even 15 or 20 years later, because during that 10, 15, 20 years, you're still going to be channeling, right? So this 10, 15, 20 years would be from the onset of channeling. Your nervous system begins to break down. Memory problems occur. Dementia takes place, and other mental health problems. So channeling is not a good thing. But those who are engaged in spiritual telepathy are going to grow and bloom as they contact higher impressions and live accordingly. I used to think it was good to practice telepathy, but not now. I believe it can be done so, but only purposely. What I mean by this is to first live a purposeful life. A life that will in some way help others, where you have to step outside of yourself, outside of your bias, outside of your opinions and self-centeredness and personal ambitions. Next, participate in a meditation program in Seed Thought Meditation. Seed Thought Meditation slowly finds our consciousness expanding into levels of contemplation and intuition. There's part of the title. Okay. Telepathy and intuition. Okay, so there's our intuition. Most especially meditate and think deeply during sun festivals, like we have one coming up in Libra. Also during solstice and annual equinox cycles. These are really, really good times to meditate deeply. This is when telepathy is usually easier to experience. Telepathic dreams are where the person has the ability to receive and project impressions. Receive and project impressions and to remember them. For example, the person is in a higher plane ashramic class where everyone is listening to the teacher talk about certain ideas. Or in the same or even a different dream, you may meet alone with the teacher who opens your eyes about your service, your life service and future. Then there are times when you are meeting in an enormous amphitheater where there seem to be many, many people, and the teacher is telepathically speaking to everyone, and each person hears in their native language. For example, the teacher may be speaking in an unknown language, but you understand it sometimes in the early stages, you're going to wake up and remember that you had a really nice dream, but you really don't remember much of it. The most beautiful approach to developing a telepathic consciousness is to clean yourself. Undergo the process of what we call sublimation, transmutation, and transformation. Sublimation, transmutation, and transformation. Then, if you can, live in the mountains and a location with minimal pollution. The airways are so polluted today that it makes spiritual telepathy increasingly difficult. It is still possible, but you have to be more disciplined in your thoughts and while living a healthy life. In telepathy, there are physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels. I'm going to repeat that just for clarity, perhaps. In telepathy, there are physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels. Hearing the communications clearly is to avoid all obstacles that prevent correct interpretation. It's just like sometimes when you're in a room where there's a lot of background noise and someone is speaking softly to you, and you can see their mouth moving and you can hear an occasional word, and then you fill in the blanks, right? And you hope that you heard correctly. We want to move beyond that because it's the same experience where we receive these telepathic communications, but we cannot correctly translate them or interpret them. There are certain reasons that prevent us from correctly hearing, correctly interpreting what we are hearing, what we are listening to during those telepathic moments, whether it is in their dreams or when they are writing inspired poetry, or even giving an inspired lecture, or listening soul to soul with another person. It can be any number of interferences coming from your personal environment or due to electromagnetic atmosphere, due to the electromagnetic atmosphere. All of us have the potential to be conscious in the astral and mental planes, whether we are sleeping or awake. We all have that potential. This is what is called having a multi-dimensional consciousness. It is no longer that unique, especially for our young ones who have escaped being trapped in drugs, alcohol, and other hallucinating substances. And especially if you are mentally healthy with no syndromes and so forth. So we need to learn how to have a multidimensional consciousness, how to think physically, astrally, and mentally simultaneously, and then eventually add the spiritual dimensions. As we develop this kind of lighted consciousness, we will then become a multi-dimensional person who will live in multi-dimensional planes and locations simultaneously, and with various bodies, and with a telepathy that they have developed. We know these things to be true, not necessarily through science fiction, although we see these things, you know, in really, really advanced movies of science fiction. But we see this in our teachers, we see evidence, we see and read stories about great ones over their many incarnations, and those that we know today have had all of these experiences. So as we start developing our own telepathy, what's so beautiful is that knowing these things happened, you know, to those great ones, keeps us sane and also keeps us out of trouble, keeps us avoiding or keeps us from lower psychism, engaging in lower psychism. You know, when I will have to confess that in my early years of studying spiritual ideas and knowledge and so forth, I was encouraged by a teacher to develop this lower psychic power, and it was real easy for me. And but there was an instinct, a mechanism inside me that said this is wrong. So I'm having to deal with a teacher who gave me a book on telepathy and how to develop it and practice it. She says, you've got to read this. And what happened to me is one day I was in a grocery store just walking down the aisle, and this entity came into my aura, who is a hunchback man, and that did it for me. I knew I had become an open conduit, and it was going to get me in trouble. So I went to a couple of friends who I really, really trusted, and the three of us talked in how to stop these things from happening, which was not easy, actually, to stop these kind of communications. But the first thing I did is I took the book back to the teacher and said, I am not interested. So that was a difficult moment, because I always respect my teachers. But in this case, she was wrong. She directed me, you know, incorrectly for the type of person that I was. So it's not that I don't believe in these events, you know, called channeling and lower psychism, and perhaps maybe it was a good thing to have that experience, you know, to know that it was not good. And it wasn't just that one experience in the grocery store. You know, I'd had several experiences where I was very uncomfortable. And then finally, that was it. In the grocery store, no. Yeah, this little guy really wanted to, you know, experience Earth. And boy, he had this prime candidate, you know, in the grocery store. No. Anyway, so stay away from channeling. I can attest it is not the right thing to do. Helena Rourke instructed her students to develop their senses. Develop your senses, she said. In the early days, the original members of her inner circle and later ones were told, refine your senses and expand your consciousness. Refine your senses and expand your consciousness. In a letter written April 12th, 1935, she talks a little bit about refining the senses regarding the chakras. She mentions 21 centers. She explained the opening and transmuting of these 21 centers causes a kindling of the rest, as many centers have double branches. For a high spiritual development, she wrote, not only the opening of the centers is essential, but their transmutation also, as the mere opening of one or two centers leads to nothing more than lower psychism, and through lower psychism to many dangers. In general, without the help of the teacher, the correct opening of the centers is quite impossible. Of course, she says, I mean the highest teacher, as only such a teacher is able to know the true condition of the organism in all of its envelopes. Only the teacher can regulate the blood pressure, which becomes so dangerous during the opening of the centers, to say nothing of their fiery transmutation. Therefore, the teaching tells us that there is a long stage of preparation for the organism. The teaching instructs, absolutely essential is the purification of the thoughts and heart. Then comes the broadening of the consciousness. Broadening of the consciousness, refinement of the senses, cultivation of an open heart. An open heart is the organ of synthesis. An open heart is the organ of synthesis. Purification of our thoughts and heart refines the senses and unfolds spiritual development. Not only can such purification cause the opening of the centers, but it can possibly attract the attention of the great teacher, who will then watch us. Eventually, if our spiritual quality permits, as in the case of Helena Rourke, a dangerous test may take place where the great teacher may even permit the next step, the fiery transmutation of the centers. Without a purified spirituality, we can go through all the known exercises for the stimulation of the nerve centers, but at best only achieve a pitiful psychism or developed mediumship, if the potentiality exists. And then the person can easily become a victim of any obsessor. So this was a little bit of what I wanted to talk about earlier. The thing is that I've learned from other really experienced teachers is that there may come a time where, despite their purity, despite their open heart, they can still come under the attack of a dark one, because these dark ones are very cunning and great imitators, and they can almost exactly imitate the frequency of a great one and appear as a great one. So the one with spiritual telepathy of that level has to always be aware, always be vigilant, and always when questioning, is this real? Is this accurate? Is this from the master? If there is a question, they're going to stop. So it tells us no matter whether we are experiencing telepathy at lower levels or higher levels, we must always be vigilant. And part of that vigilance includes our health. If we are not in good physical, emotional, mental health, if we have mental imbalance, if we have certain mental syndromes, or if our physical etheric body is going through certain health cycles that may be caused because of these unfolding centers, be real cautious when you receive inspiration and particularly guidance, because you can be misled and sent down the wrong path. So these are things I've just learned from myself and from others, that physically, gosh, we see and hear stories, about a person who appears to be sane and happy and wholesome and the kind of individual you really want to be a friend with. And then all of a sudden, after they build a friendship with you, they turn and they're obsessed and they come after you. So the same thing happens on other planes of consciousness. So no matter what, particularly in today's age, we have to be careful. What comes to mind is this phrase, you've heard me say this over and over again, where my teacher said, trust everyone and no one. It continues to take on new and higher dimension. They trust everyone and no one. So let me close with this. It is a natural or gradient unfolding process that leads to spiritual telepathy, where 1, our senses are developed according to the level of our consciousness. We're not going to force anything. Our senses are developed according to the level of our consciousness. They naturally develop, and our consciousness will naturally expand. Number 2, raising our consciousness from one plane to another gives a psychic stimulation of energies to our senses, causing them to open and unfold. This is the natural way to develop the centers and nerves. The head center is number 3. The head center has 1,000 petals. 1,000 petals. The heart center has 12 petals. The throat center has 96 petals. Senses develop when the petals of the centers start to open by the pressure of an expanding consciousness. This is the esoteric science. Senses develop when the petals of the centers start to open by the pressure of an expanding consciousness. This is why if you are an unhealthy person, maybe you've been healthy for 50 years, 60 years, and now your health is starting to break down for various reasons. You have to take care of your health, physical, emotional, mental health, Don't say God is going to take care of it. God helps those who help themselves, right? Okay, number 4. The senses unfold, petal by petal. Whenever you expand your consciousness a little, one petal of your senses opens. Consequently, your senses become multidimensional. 5, when 6 petals of a sense, 6 petals of a sense is open, the sense, if active on the physical, emotional, and mental planes, is at this point active in 3 dimensions. Do you want me to repeat that? When 6 petals of a sense are open, the sense, if active on all 3 planes of consciousness, physical, emotional, mental, it is at this point this sense is active in 3 dimensions, and so forth. Number 6, these senses can also be active on the intuitional plane. There's intuition again, okay? Okay. So these senses can also be active on the intuitional plane, where eventually we will become 4-dimensional human beings. But we have a ways to go. And number 7, and the last one, to work safely is to work on our consciousness, not on our centers. Work on our consciousness. Do not work on the centers at all. The right method to develop the centers is to nourish them with your developing and expanding consciousness. So that's telepathy. I think it's beautiful. This is the teaching. It gives us some real practical approaches to understand and then to practice these higher frequencies and phenomenon that are available to us, but must be done safely and purposely.